Those who don't know, this is Fred, FKS, over from the Astro team, and I couldn't be more excited to have him here, especially with the recent announcements. So yeah, want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been a busy week for us. We've been kind of heads down for the last year working on Astro, and we just announced our V1 beta. We announced some SSR features, which is pretty huge for us and kind of unlocks a ton of what makes Astro cool for like just a lot of the modern web audience right now. So couldn't be more thrilled about those two things. A bunch of other announcements around themes and integrations, but those being the two kind of headlines, it's been a big week for us.
Yeah, that's super awesome to hear. For those that don't know, could you give a little bit about Astro, what it is, and why somebody might use it?
Yeah, so Astro is another web framework or web meta framework, whatever you want to call that kind of site builder part of your web stack. So similar to Next.js or SvelteKit, but also even kind of going back to like 11D or Hugo. Our main focus up to this point and still to this day has been static sites. So marketing sites, blogs, your recipe websites, anything that's mainly content focused is like right where Astro kind of slots in and specializes. So it has this really unique performance story, which we can touch on, called partial hydration, which at the end of the day, you just end up shipping like 90% less code down to the browser, making us really competitive with like using Next.js or one of the other kind of React frameworks for that use case. So it's been really exciting to now open that up to SSR. So dynamic data still works, but content ends up still being our main focus area. So if you have a content site, do check it out. It's been a really awesome project.
Of course. Obviously, to chat, if there's any issues with audio or video, please let me know. Doing my best to monitor it live, but also got to be a decent host too. So expect some jank. But yeah, for those that don't know, I've also been a huge Astro fan and generally Fred fan forever. I've had a couple gigs where I was an early Snowpack consumer for the like ES build and Veep days of like crazy new build tools. I was super excited to have something rethinking the workflow of building websites. And it makes a ton of sense that Fred has now moved over to working on site builder tools more directly rather than just the packages. The problem is now, what if no packages? What if building a website as simple as possible that works as reliably as possible? And I've been using Astro, not obviously for a super fancy dynamic web app like Ping, but for a bunch of our static site. My blog's been on Astro since like mid to late last year, I would say, right?
I was going to say the t3.gg, I think, was our first like Twitter testimonial where like you started with like, holy shit, all caps. It's like, all right, that's going on the testimonial page.
Yeah, I remember being absolutely blown away with it. I had been playing a lot with both like Next.js static sites and like MDX bundlers within those static sites for like a homepage that would link to like the company properties as well as my blog. And did that in Next.js because that's like obviously what we've been using for everything. Figured it would be pretty annoying to port over to Astro, but I wanted to play with it for a while and knew that it would be a decent enough fit. Spun it up quick, installed like the things I needed, got Tailwind working, started hacking around with it, and was able to, for the most part, copy paste over my JSX, clean up like the import slightly, rename class name to class, and it just kind of worked for me. And the result was a 280 kilobyte bundle knocked down to like 15 or so, if I recall. Like the only actual like chunk in the pipe in our like network tab was the SVG because I hadn't compressed it yet.
Yeah. For anyone who doesn't know, so the reason for that, right, was the fact that like Next.js, and I say Next.js, it's like any one of these frameworks that's trying to be a universal server client app, works by like building your site on the server and like turning it into HTML to send to the user, but then it ships your whole website that you just built on the server again to the client. And that gives you a lot of cool stuff, like being able to navigate from tab to tab and have all this, like, it becomes a JavaScript application is really what your website is. But for like a marketing site or a homepage, right, like that's kind of overkill for what you're trying to do. So what Astro does, it strips all that away, only hydrates the individual components that need it. And that's why you can get something, like an entire app reduced down to just the interactive components on the page. So it's a really cool model. It's fairly unique in the space.
Yeah. There's a lot of those unique things about Astro that were really exciting to me. There's one that I feel like was talked about a lot at the beginning that isn't as much now. And I'd love to just chat a bit more about it if in particular, if your philosophy around it has changed. Astro was really big on not being a JavaScript framework, but letting you kind of bring your own JavaScript framework. So rather than having a reactivity component, you had examples of how to install React, Preact, Svelte, Vue, even Solid early on to show you how to do interactivity without expecting us to hold your hand to interactive like design.
Yeah, Nate would love, Nate on the team would love that you just said that. That was actually a kind of a conscious thing that we realized over the last year. When we launched Astro, we were like really scared of just like, what are people going to think about this? So we really leaned into like, don't worry about like what Astro is. Think about this fact that you can bring your own framework. And if you like React, that means you bring React. If you like Vue, you bring Vue. Svelte, Preact, Solid now. We had this really, really flexible, because we're stripping everything down, we actually can be really flexible about this component is hydrating with React, this one's hydrating with Svelte. You can mix and match if you want. That's still a really cool feature that we have today, but I think if anything, we've learned that Astro can kind of sit on its own foundation. Like, we're confident enough that what we're building is what people want. So it's still a major thing that we're doing, but honestly, the performance story and the flexibility as a concept, I think, is what we hit on more these days. I just don't want to get into the micro front end debate. I feel like that's like, people hear me say mix and match frameworks and they say no, and they run away. I don't know if I'm ready to step into that, but you can with Astro. Whether you think it's a good idea or not, totally up to you.
Yeah, I have definitely been in that debate enough times, and funny enough, on both sides of it, but totally agree. It's not exactly productive ground for good conversation, but at the same time, when used properly, a lot of the problems you run into with static site generators can be solved by dropping in a component from something else. And that like mindset is really powerful. And that's kind of like what I love about Astro is Astro's not trying to replace my entire tech stack. You're not trying to rethink my web applications. You're trying to solve the problem that those things didn't solve, which is static sites. And I remember I had a quote early on Twitter that you really liked, which was all of these like these tools like Next.js and even Create React App and like or Svelte to an extent, they're focused on making the best developer experience possible for all things. But when you include all things, you're including applications, and when you include applications, you're now including a ton of JavaScript. The developer experience for building more static websites had not caught up to where those dev tools were. And what's exciting about Astro is it felt like rather than trying to convince app developers to do things the old way, it was trying to bring my developer experience to the static sites and to that like technical need.
Yeah, I was worried that this was going to be a way too like nice chat. You're being very kind about Astro, but this is the first controversy. If you're building something super dynamic for the web, don't use Astro. That's kind of our stance. Like if you're building a dashboard or like a portal or something really that's like, a ping would probably be a terrible thing to build with Astro. If you're building an application, that's not where our specialty is. We're really focused on that content site, the marketing, the e-commerce now with SSR. If the main thing on your page is content, that's where we shine. But yeah, that's kind of where we draw the line.
Yeah.
We're not trying to be everything to everyone.
It's crazy how many people don't stand up and say that. Like a lot of the modern frameworks, a lot of like new tools that I'm seeing prescribed, their favorite thing is to say, we solve every problem. We do this and that. We scale up and down, left and right, to phones, to web, to desktop apps. But Astro does this thing really well. And I don't want to speak for my audience, but I know a lot of us here have a stack that we like to use for a lot of things. I want to be clear to y'all, Next.js isn't the best solution for a lot of your blogs and for a lot of our more static content. And picking up things like Astro to fill in those needs when we run into them is super valuable. And I really love Astro as a part of my toolkit, specifically because it knows its place, it solves these problems really well, and it doesn't require me to make huge mental shifts from my current understanding of how I build things just to be productive at updating my blog.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's really, if you really zoom out, what's crazy has been over the last year, like when we started Astro, it was like, why are you messing with the SPA thing? Like that seems to be the right, like, this is super powerful. Why would you want to move away from this? And like over the last year, like React server components, like the way people are talking about this idea, like, oh, maybe we should be doing more on the server and not on the client. And like, that's the whole mentality where like Astro is at its core a framework for building mostly server-side apps that generate content. And we play around the borders of, where is the interactivity coming from and how do we support that? But like at its core, we've been able to make really interesting choices because we're saying a lot of the work should happen on the server. That doesn't mean like go write it in PHP or Ruby, But like it just means like we're not trying to be a universal app that is faking this idea that like it's the same app on the server and the client when a server is like a super beefy thing and the client is like a really limited phone on a really bad connection. Like we're basically saying that idea is, I don't want to swear, completely just wrong for a lot of use cases.
Swear all you fucking want. This is the Web Dev Wednesday
There
show.
we go.
Nothing
There we
to
go.
worry about here. But
We'll ease into that, but yeah, that's like where we I think have seen, and Ryan from Solid, and like I think a lot of other people, like Quick is like starting to realize like there's just all these cool frameworks now exploring the space that we thought was like really radical, and I think the industry, let's call it, has caught up to like doing more work on the server and not pretending that both environments are the same is a good idea.
Yeah. I actually, on that note, there was a question from Theo Rose in chat. Does Astro SSR rehydrate? And do you have any thoughts on quick and resumability? I think we could dive in even more on here. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how Astro does or could address rehydration and resumability as like time continues.
Yeah, I was chatting with Ryan about this a bit. Like we're in this really interesting place where we are collaborative with all those other frameworks and not like trying to compete. So like anyone who's doing anything, like we want to build a framework for like rehydration or resumability. Like we essentially are just this foundation for how you get that content onto the page. But whatever that component can do, we want to support it. So we support Solid. I think Ryan, like literally an hour ago, just pushed some commit to help with nested components, hydrating individual. Like we are just so like game to be a platform for those things. I think Quick is probably the most interesting, where they're, I think, trying to own the whole stack. I don't know if you can put a Quick component on an Astro site or on any site. I think it's like a full app builder, in which case that's where like, that starts to become more of a Next.js, more thing that we can't really easily plug in. Angular is kind of, there's not really an easy way to plug Angular in. So it kind of depends on what the framework's looking like. But we're not trying to like be the best UI framework. We very much want you to like, when you need interactivity, use your favorite. And that opens us up to focus where we care about, which is this like foundational part of the web stack and supporting those frameworks. I think the big question for Quick will be, can they make this really easy? Like if you've looked at Quick code, if you looked at it a year ago, it was like indecipherable. If you've looked at it now, they're starting to move closer to something that feels like React. If they can get there, I think that'll be huge. But right now, I don't know if they've been able to make the trade-off fully of like super powerful without a cost of extra complexity. Like if you look at the code, there's a ton of these like $ characters flying around and different like hooks you've never seen before just to get this idea of rehydration working. And that's like totally me like looking at it for a couple minutes. So maybe that's not a fair take, but as that Quick like first user experience, it was really overwhelming. So super powerful, but if they want to be like the expert framework, there's totally a space for that. I think we're more focused on like, how can we be a foundation for all frameworks, all developers, where from day one, if you just know HTML and JavaScript, you can build a site with Astro. Like getting started takes just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I loved that. And I think I'm ready to switch us into the first hot take mode of this call. How do I put this one? I think this is like one of my favorite things about Astro is it's not competing with like React or even Quick. It almost feels like it's competing with Vite, even though it uses it.
That's interesting. In what way?
The place in my stack and the way I think about it, in particular the problems it solves. Like it builds web applications for me. Vite does it much more generically. Astro does it with a few more opinions, but not that many more. It's like an abstraction on top, similar to how Next is an abstraction on React. Astro is an abstraction on Vite.
Yeah. If you look at it more as Snowpack became Astro, I think that's probably where that line's coming from, of like, we built Snowpack and realized like, this is too low level to do what we want. We're just building a different Webpack or a different rollup or a different ES build. Like we definitely wanted to take a more opinionated stance, which is why we kind of shifted our focus. I think it depends on where you think Vite is going. And I actually don't know I don't know the answer. I don't know if they even know the answer versus like, they just like building cool stuff. Vite is powering SvelteKit and us now and a bunch of other tools. And there's like now a testing framework for Vite and like someone's building Storybook on Vite. I wonder if they still think of themselves as a way to build websites and much more of like, oh, everyone needed this and we built it. And now we're just going to power a bunch of cool stuff, in which case I think we would compete with the former. I don't think we compete with the latter.
Yeah.
Vite is so cool. Vite is awesome. Like as someone trying to do what they did, like they they spent the time to build it. It's got its quirks, but it is an awesome foundation to build on.
Yeah, when I say that you're competing with it, I don't mean like it's like the number one thing that you're going against. I mean, in comparison to React or even Quick, I would consider you more competition with Vite in terms of when I'm spinning up a new project that's going to be like a mostly static site with a decent dev experience where I don't have to mentally shift off React too hard. I'm picking between those two things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the other thing murky, like the idea of being in competition with them and using them at the same time, I think is what trips me up on this. But I do see what you're saying. What makes it even murkier is like every UI framework is now like moving down the stack. Like React building features specifically for Next in this like V18, like all the suspense stuff, all the streaming, like that's only for the server frameworks like Next to use and leverage. Like that idea of like, oh, we support any UI framework is like, well, but these UI frameworks are now like also full platform. So what do you, it's the lines are starting to blur. Like it feels like we've had a decade of like a really solid, like here's what everything is and isn't. And like in the last couple of years, I think everything's starting to change a little bit. I don't know if that's ESM or like ES build or Vite or like what's causing that, but just everything seems to be changing. It's like blurred lines now.
This is something I actually think about way too much for somebody whose job is in dev tools. I really love the idea of like focused effort allowing innovation, and I think that's like one of React's biggest strengths isn't the problems it solved so much as the problems it didn't. React was very specific about what it did. It made it so your state and your UI weren't so directly tied, so you could change your state and rebuild your UI, and now we can abstract so many cool like developer wins on top of this. Like things like hooks didn't, like, yes, it came from the React team and that helps a ton, but the mindset that led to hooks came from the way that React was built and the abstraction that it represented mentally for us without making assumptions about the rest. Where something like Angular, I really don't believe could ever have kickstarted like a lot of community level innovation, because something like Angular comes with a lot of things prescribed in it. React not doing that was the key that made it win, and also the key that made the innovation around it and the general web dev community possible. I think that being closer to the server, much like exposing an animation layer and not having use effects, those are things that obviously benefit developers. But doing those too early and too aggressively prevents the innovation that gets us there, where I don't know if we would have had good patterns around server rendering if it wasn't for Next.js solving that in a heavy but really good for developers way. I feel like Astro's in the first step there. Like right now, it's kind of doing what React did, but for site generation and the server side, and it's slowly moving forward. I don't think it will ever introduce like a proper state management library or full client side like updates in a way that React might. In the same way, I wouldn't expect React to provide an alternative to Express, but you're going to dip that way eventually, the same way they are here, as that's where the market will push you.
Yeah, our thinking, and it's like why we started with a static site builder first, is it's easier to move up that like ladder versus down it. Like if you start with fully featured applications, it's really hard to like, oh, and also we do really lightweight marketing sites or e-commerce sites. Like it's really hard to go back once you've opened that door. So we've like intentionally made decisions that have limited that story, but it's all been intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Astro is unique in that way where it acknowledges that dynamic apps are not the thing it solves, but it still interops with the technologies from there as much as necessary for like me to not have the mental shift going from React to Astro is huge for us. And at the same time, being able to pull in React components, Preact components, whatever, when we need a dynamic search piece or something along those lines. Like it's willing to acknowledge when those pieces are valuable without forcing you into a whole different mindset to get there.
Yeah, definitely. That's the goal. Like I think we see the world of web developers. Like I can't remember who was tweeting like the graph of like Next.js adoption versus just like Webpack. Like, or no, sorry, not Webpack, WordPress. Like there's this whole group of developers out there that like we spend all day talking about React server components versus Jamstack versus like all this like really cool tech, which is awesome. And then there's this entire world that's like still building their sites like, the way WordPress said to 10 years ago. And it's really hard to get them on board with this new way of building sites. Like, that's a huge mental shift. And I think that's even more where we see this, like, if that's the chasm, can we kind of be the bridge between them? Like, we haven't even talked, like, Astro syntax, there's a like real HTML templating element to it. Like, even though it feels super modern and you can put React components, like, it still is HTML based. That's fully in the idea of, like, most developers want that bridge to the new modern stack. Can we be that bridge is the question we're trying to answer for sure.
Very interesting. As I mentioned before, we started, I haven't looked into the Astro SSR stuff at all. I don't even know what it looks like or how a developer would interact with it. Want to give a TLDR for next devs on how we should mentally think about Astro's new SSR patterns?
Yeah, I was going to say, my goal is you're being very kind to Astro. I want you to hate it by the end of it. That's the controversial goal. No, I really want to dig into it because I think it's going to be a lot more interesting, like just how it looks. Yeah, I'd say our goal, so a part of being that bridge means feeling familiar. And the big thing we talked about in our V1 launch post was like, this should feel familiar to anyone. Like, we've tried to provide an anchor for anyone to kind of grasp their understanding around. So if you use Next.js, there's API routes in a similar way. And then, like, your pages are essentially like pages in Next.js. We use file-based routing. If you use SvelteKit, like, our component structure feels a lot like Svelte in that it's this like HTML-based single file component. You could say the same for Vue and like Nuxt. Yeah, it's a really interesting, I'd say we tried to borrow like the best things we liked from every one of these. We've been very lucky to come after that first wave of frameworks. So we try to grab the good ideas where we could and build on them in interesting ways.
I really love that. And it's interesting because I felt like Astro was, in a lot of ways, it's a second step in a different direction that a lot of these like places have been. Like, it's a second step where like 11T was going in one direction. You're like, this path is good, but can we point over there a little bit? And now you're doing the same with like the server side. It's really cool that we can make a file that's a component, but why is it not HTML? Why are we thinking about it as this weird like interop thing between the two? And why do I have to fetch like 100 plus kilobytes of JavaScript before I can actually render the content you sent me in my HTML file?
Yeah. The phrase we used a lot in the early days was like SPAs are in their like 7th or 8th inning of like that game. Like, we have explored for like 10 years now what that looks like, from Create React app to Next.js to like whatever the next, that's a well understood path that's very deep in its evolution. And meanwhile, MPAs just like never really got off the ground. So like 11D still uses, nunjucks or handlebars. Like, these are templating languages going back to, the early 2000s, 90s? I don't think 90s.
I think early 2000s latest. Or at like, hopefully.
There's just not been the same interest in that story. And so that has just not seen the same growth and innovation. That's where I think we see the most interesting. Like, we're definitely still in like the first or second inning of this, where there's still a ton of innovation to happen, a ton of exploration. Like, we don't have to say it as much now because it was kind of our like cheap answer to like, why don't you have this cool dev tool thing? Like, we've caught up, but it's still, I think, as an ideas of like an industry, I think we're only starting to see that pendulum shift back, and there's going to be a lot more. Like, Quick and Solid and all those that are looking at the other side of this is, for the first time, feels really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I half lost my thought, and obviously when I lose my thoughts, it always goes towards how can I use this to replace my backend. I would love to hear a bit more about your thoughts around data management, backend, like APIs, and how I get a JSON blob out of my Astro build with SSR.
Yeah, we should look at the like code at some point. I think that'll probably show it best. But we support API routes the same way Next.js does. So in that same idea, you can have your Astro site be talking to an API that lives separately. That's an industry like, or a business like company API, or you can build your API totally within Astro.
One sec. You can keep chatting. Or more for stream. Sorry, I did not realize my capture card died at some point while I was setting up.
Windows you're making me want to stay on Apple as long as possible.
Wow, when I activated that, my audio went to shit. That's fun. Hopefully,
yeah,
it stays good.
I can still hear you.
Cool. Everything seems to be fine now. That was a really weird lag spike, but now I have screen share working, hopefully.
Cool.
Yay. Now we can actually look over the blog post. Is there code in here?
I think so. Matthew did a great job with this post. So it talks a lot about the motivation. Yeah, I mean, the e-commerce we kind of use to phrase this around because where we see SSR really fitting in, like dynamic data, large sites, like that's where SSGs fall down and where SSR kind of picks it back up. Yeah, Matthew tries to use this example of like how would you do authentication on like a fully static built site. Like any static site is going to be built ahead of time, which means you can't have any personalization. You're just kind of stuck like moving work to the client, which is the exact like performance story that Jamstack tries to get rid of. But what we do, and this is probably a lot of people's first time seeing Astro syntax, so I'll kind of touch on that a bit. By being so like not dynamic, like you have your server code and your client code and kind of treating them as two separate things, we get to build a language for Astro that is much more optimized for the server, which means we can make really simple decisions. So the way I'd phrase it is like everything in Svelte, React, Vue was originally designed for reactivity and now has been worked backwards to the client, to the server. And a lot of that becomes unnecessary. There's no like reactivity on the server. There's no user events or setup and tear down that you really need to worry about. The way Astro syntax works is it basically takes something that is a lot more like HTML. It's essentially a superset of HTML with what we basically hijacked is this idea of front matter, which is where your server code loads and runs. So in the static site world, this idea was like you can run some code before you build your page, and then the page can reference those assets. And SSR has unlocked this idea of this is the part of your page that runs, handles the request coming in, collects your data, and then the template just templates with it. So again, we're trying to be familiar for anyone. If you use React, it's like below is kind of what gets returned by your render function. Above is the code that happens before that return. If you use Svelte or Vue, it's like here's your setup script and then here's your template. But it's really intentionally not JSX, or it's JSX in a couple of really flexible ways that makes it more actually compatible with HTML. For example, you can put an HTML template, an HTML comment in here, and it works. We're trying to be more HTML with JavaScript than JavaScript with HTML.
Very interesting. This is changing my thought process around this immediately. And I know one of the things that you were playing with and mentioned before was that you have tested TRPC and it is working. My hot take here is ideally you shouldn't need it. If I could import from Prisma and await a Prisma call and have a type safe answer here and dump that in there, that is the thing that TRPC does for me that every other framework doesn't. So can you say now, putting you on the spot, if I import Prisma, await a Prisma fetch, and then use whatever it gives me in line in here, that's going to work with type safety and autocomplete?
Yes, 100%.
You have just killed every other SSR solution for semi-static or mostly static, even some dynamic stuff for me. Because
that's sorry, go ahead. I'm obviously excited. You get it. Like this is what we can do that no one else can because we're not trying to do this run on either place thing.
Yeah, it's hilarious how by not having to bridge the chasm, the amount of power you get is huge. So another thing we talked about a little bit before the stream was the idea of super JSON and how it works in TRPC. So for those who are less familiar, super JSON is a transformer that allows a JSON piece that you return from server or are passing around to be encoded with more data than JSON normally has. So if I'm on a server and I return a date, time, or I return a map, and then that has to be encoded as JSON, that's going to lose the date time, that's going to lose the map, it's going to lose a lot of the safety and the typing that I get in JavaScript land just by making it JSON, because JSON's a limited subset of static JavaScript types. Super JSON lets you encode more, so you can actually have that map from your server make it to your client, or that date time, or any other things that JSON isn't compatible with. As long as it's not a function or a class, it'll probably make it over okay. The reason that's necessary is if I have a TypeScript function on the server and now I want to call that on the client, those are two different runtimes, and there's a bridge that message has to cross over. And super JSON allows for that bridge to not lose type safety inherently. There's no bridge here. HTML comes out.
Yep, 100%. Now I will be clear, this is where the kind of limitations and the trade-offs we make, right? So if you want something that's loading data on the client, you do still have to figure that out. Oh my God. What's your cat's name?
This is Miles. He's the
All right, so if you're buying food for miles on an e-commerce site and you need to load some dynamic data, you still need some idea of an API. But for fully server rendered stuff, yeah, you can just make a database call directly. You can use Prisma. You can talk to your CMS, and all directly on the server.
Yeah, it's so nice to not have to traverse a gap for those types of things. But now, as you said, with e-commerce, there's a whole separate category of problems here, the idea of post. And to be frank, this is actually one of the things I think that Remix solves really well with their action primitive and how it combines with forms. It makes it really clear. Oh, yeah, the little tail. Yeah, very needy boy. But I love how it is so considerate of how post works and how that results in a page of its own. And with e-commerce, that makes a ton of sense too, where I have a post that sends some data and then it returns me the checkout results page. Does the solution here offer anything in that regard around posting and making mutation type changes?
Yeah, so there's two ways we go about that. One is if you want something that's super API driven, you can build a API route similar to Next.js. It gets a request, it handles it, a get, a post, whatever it is, and it can send back, whatever HTML, JavaScript, JSON, whatever you need. So if you're building, something that makes that form as a post to an API that gets and receives JSON, that's one option. If you want to build a site with no JavaScript at all, that same front matter that's handling, okay, when someone basically hits this request and hits this route, this is the code that's going to run. You can do something different if it's a post versus a get. So in that traditional way that sites used to work, right? The form would literally hit the same route, but now as a post, and it would do some work and then get back HTML with that success or fail. That's essentially the same model that you can build here. So in that front matter, actually check if it's a post, do some stuff, and then basically in the UI of that response, you can put in a success message, a fail message. You could put some JSON that then gets read later by the page if you want to handle that message client side. It's a super flexible way to handle the page. Yeah, I think we don't talk about forms as much, but I get the sense it's very similar to what Remix has been trying to do with forms, where it's why can't I handle the form logic within the single page where the form lives? It's a similar model there.
Yeah, interesting. I don't think of, when I look at a template, my thought isn't immediately I can post here. And I think that that's a mental shift I have to make as someone who hasn't touched PHP in a very long time. that gut feel is weird at the moment. I'm immediately but where do I key my inputs? How do I make the input sanitize? How do I make sure the forms submitting the right fields and the relationship between those is well defined?
Yeah.
And
so
as Alex puts it, why do people care about forms without JavaScript so much? And yeah.
It's kind of like with micro front ends. I don't know if that's how people are building sites anymore. It's definitely not the way that they have been in SPAs. And I think what we're trying to piece apart is, have we moved to more client-side validation because we wanted to, or because we it was there and we used it because we could? I still like client-side validation. So I'm still probably more, if I was going to build it, I would probably do more of an API world. And again, that's where TRPC could handle some of those posts for me, and it kind of lives alongside. But the page rendering the data that gets loaded, that could all happen with direct calls to the database. So we're trying to be as flexible as possible. And again, it's early, so we're still learning how people want to build sites in this model.
I think the browser should have Zod built in, but that's a whole separate argument for another week.
Build Zod into the browsers,
yes.
You cowards.
Yes. I saw the top however many packages should just come built into the browser. It's okay, can I go force install enough Zods to make that happen? So that's the one where that would be useful. Load 0.js except for Zod. That'd be great.
You're never going to beat jQuery. jQuery is still, if anything's going in the browser, it's jQuery.
I know. I hate it, but I know. I did see a good question from Dwin Eduarda. Almost definitely butchered your name, but he asked, does Astro's SSR also allow for error catching on the server?
Yeah, basically whatever happens in that front matter is yours to control. So I'd say that's kind of the trade-off. The trade-off is that this will never run in the client, but the win is that if you imagine how that works, you were saying where's my function for protecting this and where's my function for validation, where Blitz or Remix are here's a bunch of exported functions, they all run in a certain order, and you're living totally in JavaScript function land. That front matter, that's a fully kind of, I guess you could call it flat or like serial. Like it's just going from top to bottom. If it hits a return, you're going to do whatever that return was. Otherwise, it's rendering the whole page that you gave it. So you can look at the data that got posted, check it out, analyze it, and template or redirect based on what was posted.
That is really cool and also different. One of the weird things, even just from the example, I'll pull it back up here, that caught me is something I feel like Next.js doesn't like explicitly discourage, but very much implicitly does. This idea of like, if no user, return astro.redirect. This code immediately scared me because I'm mentally in React land where user comes from session and session might not have hydrated yet. So if we redirect when session hasn't hydrated, it might be a valid session we just don't have yet, and this is going to immediately kick you off the page before finished loading. But
Theo, you're carrying all this baggage around. You're carrying this baggage. You just got to let it go.
Yeah, I'm an application developer, Fred. This baggage is part of my job. But yes, I have to let go of it when I'm looking at static site solutions like this.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, if your page is just loading a user and trying to hydrate as quickly as possible, that's where this model still works pretty well. If you were moving from page to page and going from like, this user page to this data page, like a dashboard or something really dynamic, an application, obviously this would get a little bit more expensive and a little bit harder to stay on top of in terms of managing that data from page to page, session to session. But for this use case, you're hitting a new page. We do all the work on the server, send it back to the user on the client side. And then you can kind of send this data back down to the page if you want. We're still figuring that out as well, but that's where we operate most, is on that server logic.
Send the data back down to the page. That's the part that I tend to get all interested and huffy in, because every page I have built, other than my blog for the last like however many years, has multiple back and forths that have to occur. It just in the way that page works. Like I probably have more non-optional state in the preview page for joining a call and ping than the average e-commerce site has across the entirety of it.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the part we're most curious to figure out. Like, just because we're saying that like you should do more work on the server doesn't mean that there isn't some communication that probably needs to happen. So that idea of passing data, like you've done all the work to load this user, how can we pass that to the client more efficiently? Like, why would the client have to hit that a second time? Right now, you could literally put a script tag that like sets that on a global in your template. Like you can do it. It's just going to be a little gnarly. That's where I think our, this V1 is kind of about like, cool, here's the platform. What do we build on top of it?
Okay. Anything else? Oh, I was going to ask if there are more cool code examples in here, but
yeah, this is something we talked about a bit, but just this will feel really similar to anyone coming from Next.js or SvelteKit, probably Remix too. Like inside your pages directory, which is where all this file-based routing happens, you can put any .js file is going to handle any request that matches it. And instead of returning with HTML, it's going to return with whatever you tell it. So give it the content type, give it the extension, and it'll return with that data.
Okay. And using this, I do not have to so if I had a fresh Astro project, just a init Astro SSR, I write this, I link that repo to Cloudflare, to Deno deploy, and to Vercel. Do I have to make any code changes for this to successfully deploy on all three?
Yes, so the last section of this is talking about our adapter model, which is similar to SvelteKit and I think Remix.
Had to scroll one more page.
You were one pixel away. Yeah, like that's a model we really like. It puts all the complexity of configuration on that like one layer of plugin. So for us, that's an adapter, and it basically one per your deployable host. So we launched with one for Netlify, Node.js, and Deno. And like this whole launch is like, okay, this is ready to build on. Like we've been chatting with Vercel, and actually Vercel already has one made by the community member as of this morning. So there's a lot of excitement around growing that layer now between what our V1 was, which is this week, the V1 beta, to the actual official V1 coming in June.
Makes a ton of sense. I will say, looking at this, one of the immediate exciting possibilities for me, and the reason I asked if adapters were necessary or not, is this looks very TRPCable in the sense that this is a primitive I could very quickly plug the TRPC server into and now have Astro as a way to deploy TRPC endpoints that I could then consume in my client arbitrarily and test in different use cases which of these solutions is the best thing for my users. And that is surprisingly hard to do right now. It is nigh impossible to take a generic like TRPC and implement it in a way where I can, ideally with one set of code, deploy that 3 different places and then performance test against all of them. I have been trying to find a reasonable way to do this for months now.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we need to have like the one super deployment adapter that just tries them all, does a performance check, and then that's now where you go.
Seriously though, that the problems that everybody says that they've solved and hasn't is like performance regression testing and environment variables.
Yeah.
Anybody who says they've solved them is lying to you or hasn't solved any real problems.
But like that's exactly. I feel like that's where we can. That's like I think about that all the time. Like the fact that we are fully focused on this foundation means like secrets aren't like how you do secrets in React is not that different from Svelte. Is not that different from Vue. Like I think that's where if we can not be distracted by the UI part of things and like let you use your favorite framework, we can start to build out like one solution that, again, doesn't have to be what everyone uses, but like to use Solid again as an example, like when Ryan launched Solid, it was like, cool, that's like awesome. How do I build a site with Solid? And it's like, can't use Next, can't use any one of these like full stack frameworks. Like that's a whole other thing you have to build. And like just by chance that we were coming out with Astro at the same time, we're like, oh yeah, we can build a adapter for Solid the same way we do Preact or React. And like within a day, we had like, oh, Astro powering Solid, and Solid now as a framework gets access to our routing, to how we build sites. So it's like if we could become this thing that anyone can leverage for building sites, that would be cool. It obviously means we have to support everyone, which is, we've kind of grown out our area of what we care about in a different way. But the idea of like the way secrets work isn't different per framework. Like the way that we handle performance monitoring, that's not that different. Like there's stuff like that that I really think is be an interesting place for us to focus coming out of the V1 in June.
Yeah, I think when I said that I consider you more in competition with Vite and with other things like Next.js, this is what I meant. Where Astro is if I a framework developer, like let's say I was making Solid 2 or like T3.js as a new client-side rendering framework. My choice as I make the recommendation of how do you work with this, my decisions between Vite and rolling my own or Astro and integrating there. And that's a really interesting place you've positioned yourself where you are the Next.js without the React now. And that allows for framework developers that might not have known if or how to build the Next.js server-side part. They now can consume that part, play with it, or even buy fully into it without having to build it themselves.
Yeah, we think that's a huge opportunity for that.
Yeah, it's like.
Can I also go on a quick tangent?
Yeah, please do.
Guess what the first JavaScript framework I ever worked on was called?
What was it called?
T3.js. I worked at a company called Box. If you don't know, it's like Dropbox, but for enterprise people. We had an internal framework, which we briefly open sourced, built by Nicholas Zakis of ESLint fame. It was called T3.js. There is still a website out there somewhere. I don't think it's been maintained in a very long time. It was right before React and like Webpack. So it was like still for that world of like Bower. But so if I use that as like a funny example name, I've literally worked on a framework called T3.js.
For copyright's sake, T3.ts from here point forward.
Okay, perfect. There we go. My lawyers will retract.
That's hilarious, though. I had no idea that name had ever been used for anything. It is too bad of a name for anyone else to use it for anything. So
there was I'm sure it meant for something some internal joke.
Yeah.
I'll find the website and send it to you. I think it still exists.
Yeah, I'm still deep in thought on what it means to be Next.js for everything. Like, how do I put it? Like, how do you not become web components for servers where it's like it sounds really good but it doesn't work at all?
So the other tangent I'll go on is, if you don't know my background, I was on the Polymer team at Google. Like, I have a connection to web components. Like, there's a lot to love there, but like never really were able to deliver on the developer experience. And I think there's a couple of reasons on that, which like maybe I shouldn't go into. Like, it's still like what they always have going for them is like the adoption of web components continues to skyrocket. Like, if you look behind the scenes, web components are on like some XX% of like the top 1,000 websites.
It's double digit now?
Problem. What's that?
It's double digit now?
It's high, yeah, because like
That's good to
GitHub
hear.
has web components, YouTube has web components. Like, yeah, maybe it's not like number of sites versus number of page views. I don't know, but it's surprising. It's like deceptive, maybe would be the right word. So like,
Kicking out my cat.
there's
Quick, one sec. Keep ranting.
anyways. This is making me realize I don't need. Okay, Theo's gone. We're gonna talk about ping. This video quality, it's shit. It's terrible. All right, it's been breaking. Okay, here he comes. Here he comes. So anyway, web components. The problem with web components is no. So the developer experience was never really there. I think because they were just trying to be everything to everyone, maybe. But what this kind of does is like it's some of the similar ideas, but you get to use a framework you like. We're not telling you to throw anything out. Um, I don't know if there's something there where we're going to try and like componentize the back end, but yeah, it's there's a clear through line there of like what if web components, but different, and I'll say because I'm biased, better.
Yeah. A weird framing I'm going to try just from like the patterns I've been seeing is it almost feels like there's a battle between do we import the backend or do we export the backend? Like, do we import the backend in the front end or do we export the front end from the backend?
Interesting. I really like that. I've never heard that before. Interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is why I love tRPC so much. Is it is the best way to import your backend in your front end, and why I'm liking what I'm seeing with Astro here is it seems like the best way to export a front end from your backend.
That's taking me a little while to get used to, but I think I get what you're saying there. Like exporting the backend as HTML,
Yes.
and also API calls, and then also the components that you need to hydrate to make your HTML dynamic to call those APIs. Versus this idea, like, I think that's like the universal application. I just don't think is going to pan out. I think there's this guess that like the edge compute stuff makes it a little more survivable, but at the end of the day, it's like you're just doing a lot of JavaScript on the client, and phones will always be getting faster, networks will always be getting faster, but like what we're trying to build gets even more and more expensive, dynamic. Like the web of today is like very different from 10 years ago. So it seems to be on this treadmill where even though things are getting faster, like if you're shipping stuff to the client, you're just going to have a bad time.
Yeah, I have to say that there are lots of things where we will always be shipping to the client, and the things I build in particular are so client dependent that I now outright block mobile clients and non-Chrome desktop clients from accessing ping because of all of the problems related to weird memory leaks in Firefox's WebRTC layer and Safari having incorrect opinions about CSS rules for video and all of these other things that make our product look worse and feel worse than it is because the client is bad in a lot of ways, and it's the bad place to solve problems almost whenever you can. And I think that's the realization we've realized as a community is the client is always a compromise. When do we make that compromise? And who you ask gives a different answer.
Yeah, yes, but I feel like that's the exact point of like you can't be everything for everyone, right? Like you just said blocking mobile clients. Like an e-commerce site would go out of business if you pitched that, or you'd be fired.
Yeah.
But like if you're building Figma, like blocking mobile makes, or like at least reducing mobile makes a ton of sense. And like, how is one framework or one site builder gonna make both of those users happy? Yeah, when I say like shipping stuff to the client is always a bad idea, I mainly mean from that kind of like if you care about performance and if you don't need the features of the client. But yeah, if you're building Ping or Figma or anything that's running in the browser, like you need the client. You're trying to make an application, like it's in the name application. Like you definitely need some code to run. Um, I don't mean to rehash the old like websites versus web apps or like documents versus apps. Like that debate feels a little lacking nuance, but like it's a similar, I think, thread to pull on, which is like there just seem to be either two certain use cases or like a spectrum that everyone falls on. And I think everyone who's tried to define the spectrum just gets flamed by some part of it. But like you had a graph that I think I saw getting some heat flying around on Twitter where you tried like it's it's a unforgivable task or a thankless job, but there seems to be some reality to that.
Yeah, I like what is an app and when do I blur the line and when do I cross the line? Those are all hard questions, and the result is now everybody using React even when they shouldn't be, and then moving their application to app.site.com and having a Webflow homepage that is as static as possible so that they don't have mobile clients bouncing all the time anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the, I mean, now I'll say that we say like don't build a super dynamic application with Astro, this foundation, but then you can put components in. So you can put a React component on your page and it'll hydrate whenever you want it at whatever level of kind of like urgency. So you get this really nice component by component loading mechanism versus all page all the time. That means you can put an SBA in an Astro site. Like you can do it and like it's going to be pretty good. You're not going to get much more than just hydration. So you're not going to get the features of an Next.js other than just, SSR HTML generation before the user sees it. But it's possible. So like, I don't know. Maybe it's more like you shouldn't use it, but you can. I don't know where the line gets blurred. Like you can do it. We're not going to stop you, but like that's not what we care about. Like you will do that knowing that that's not what we're focused on.
So this is reminding me of like a debate I have had at Ping. I don't really have. I'm thinking like, who should I ask before I share these like technical details of what we're doing at the company? And then I realize I'm the person who I would ask, and my answer is share whatever the hell I feel like. So at Ping, we have a system for embeds where we take a video call and bundle that in a separate web page that you can embed into things like OBS or other software that can open a web page. That way you don't have to have a specific audio video proprietary solution. You can just open a web page and use that as the source for passing video from A to B. The thing about that web page is it's part of our Next.js application, which allows us to very quickly like share our player, share our backend, get all the things we need, and embed that. But it also means we have to load like 400 kilobytes of JavaScript before we can even make the connection to then send the first video frame in an embed. And now we have a big React application running in the background there, checking a bunch of stuff and doing analytics that we don't really need for that client. And what I like, my ideal here, because again, everybody has their own like different needs, would be Next.js with a reliable ability to opt different routes in and out of client-side JavaScript almost at all. Or even better, the ability to have one route with like a separate bundle and a really minimal like solid JS app, and the rest of the routes all managed the same way through Next.js. File-based routing will never get us there. That's just a fact. So it feels like what I'm asking for is a hybrid of Astro, React Router, and micro front ends, where only one of those micro front ends can be loaded at a given time. And it's actually impossible. There will eventually be something that looks kind of like it in the future, and I will hate it immediately because it doesn't click with me. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, that is a very specific need. But I get what you're saying, right? Like that, it's kind of what you're getting at with like different parts of your front end. If you think of a company as its entire front end, like even within a company, you have different needs. And I mean, the bigger question there is like, should one thing do everything? Like there's obviously some like operational wins there, but I don't know, based on what you described, is the kind of subdomain path really the worst thing in the world?
It is in the sense of the obnoxious workarounds on cores and cookie management, but it's not the worst thing ever, and it's probably going to be our end game. We're probably going to spend a lot more time in Turbo Repo and make something that works out of that, but at this point in time, it's a little painful. I saw somebody mention, Alex mentioned, am I not just asking for solid/svelte that ships less JS? No, I really like React, and it solves a lot of problems for us. I want Next.js, but my homepage isn't 500 kilobytes plus of JavaScript, and the other routes that are semi-dynamic don't have to load all of Next.js for that. I almost want like Next.js bundled one layer higher, where at that layer I can opt into or out of Next, and then do other things for other routes.
I mean, I feel like it's like you want server components, but like if they work the way we all thought they worked.
Yes. Yeah. Server components, if they worked, is a great way to describe what I want.
That's not really what I said, but like for the hot take, I'll allow it.
Yeah, I went on a long rant about server components recently. Actually, the last stream, I think, because I could not get the Next.js server components build to work at all locally. It just was not running. But yeah, I believe that we're in the very early stage of importing the back end in the front end. I think server components are a great example of how much mental hurdles, or like how many mental hurdles we're gonna have to get over for us to have a conversation about that, much less actually like be able to use it in production consistently. Like
Yeah.
the idea of a component that looks, acts, and mentally maps to a React component, but it runs somewhere else, and I have to worry about all of the consequences of that. It's a
Yeah.
huge mental shift, and I'm excited to make it. And I'm excited for the community too. But this is also a big enough shift where it could be the time to break in and kill it. Like this could be React's Red Wedding.
Jesus, yeah. I mean, if you go back to the analogy of like we want to be this bridge between like old school WordPress devs and like where the modern web has gone over the last 10 years, like React server components are like two tectonic plates moving further apart. Like the client's getting more complex. And versus like Astro is just like unapologetically like, here's your server code, go build components for the client in the framework you like. So it's this really much more clear, like, yeah, everything you have to juggle in your head. And Quick's the same way. Like everything you need to juggle in your head to achieve this really powerful thing. If it again, and that's if it delivers on the promise, this like promise of a really powerful thing. I am not convinced, based on what I've seen over the last couple of years, that the mass majority of developers are going to want that. I think Quick, like that's the thing. Like, and I say all this, and like Quick shouldn't. I don't think if they are always the more complicated answer to this problem, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think there's a huge audience for like expert level developers who want an expert level tool that's harder to hold, but when you hold it right, it's like super powerful. I'm just not convinced that that is the majority of developers.
I would go a step further and say it almost prevents their ability to succeed in a post React world where post React development is different. There is a level of community innovation that honestly I kind of think takes from like the Linux world more than anything. Like this idea that all of these pieces are isolated and do the thing they're supposed to, and we have this platform, the Unix and now Linux platform, that we can extend and do all these crazy things with. And I feel like React did that to application development, not even just web dev, but applications are now written in a more piecemeal way rather than we have a front end and we have a back end, or we have a client and we have a back end. It's now we have these parts that we orchestrate into user experiences. Yeah. And that's much more a front end and client side thing than it is back end. But I think both have been very affected by how React let us componentize and break down everything.
Yeah.
In a world where that's the case, things like Apple's Swift Xcode model don't graph on very well anymore. And that's why we see React Native picking up the way it does. I think I'd make the same argument for something like Quick, or even, I've said it before, SvelteKit. This is my big argument against the Svelte ecosystem is now you need Rich Harris to make every cool thing for you. Like animation doesn't get better until Rich does it or talks to somebody in depth for hours who can now go do it. It's an entire ecosystem bottlenecked to an extent by one person. He's working on that. He's written some cool blog posts about how like he extends himself as a leader now. But when you bet on something like Svelte, you've now bottlenecked every part of your stack on that choice. With something like Astro, you've bet a piece of that stack on that choice. And that's why I like these types of tools. And I think that they are destined to innovate faster and be more successable. The best something like Quick can do is learn the lessons that you learn in this place of innovation.
Yeah. I mean, that's always going to be a push-pull. Like, I feel like the React team was getting some shit on Twitter for like, oh, how do you do animation in React? Like red lines on a board, like a crazy conspiracy. And it's like, do you want it to be easy but limited in its like what it could be? Or do you want it to be open-ended, but anyone can do any package or anyone can innovate in the space? And yeah, I think React deserves a lot of credit for opening that up. Like for everyone who thinks that the whole web should be solved by one set of tools and one way of doing things, and like drink this Kool-Aid and like this will be the one true way. I think the web moves too fast for that to ever be the best answer. And I don't think that the web audience is there because they love turning their brain off and just doing what they're told. Like I haven't seen anything succeed like that in a long time.
I absolutely agree. I cannot remember the last time like I saw, honestly, since React, not much has really blown up, but nothing that is that uber prescriptive has blown up meaningfully. And I do think that we are in like the post monolith era in that way, where monoliths aren't where innovation occurs. Ruby on Rails cannot happen again in that way.
Yeah.
Ruby on Rails, with consideration for other things on the other side of the equation, can, but you're not building Ruby on Rails, you're just building Rails.
Yeah. Yeah. The most interesting marketing play I've seen in the last year, I think, is Redwood, which just did their launch week, which is the framework for startups, which is, I feel like it's super opinionated. And instead of targeting enterprises, they're targeting like startups. And instead of being like, here's an opinionated set so that your developers stop making choices, it's like, here's an opinionated set so that you don't have to make choices so that you can like ship more code. That could be an interesting way to do it. But again, like they're still on Webpack. And like, it feels like the web's moving away from that. Like it just moves too quick to pick one thing and stick to it forever. It's a treadmill.
I really need to talk to the Redwood guys. We've been like talking about and delaying a Web Dev Wednesday for like 4 or 5 months now. And I love those guys. I am really impressed with the project, but I feel like I've been told Redwood's the next big thing for at least 4 years now. Like I specifically remember talking to some of the engineers I looked up to at Twitch. We were talking about Next.js. They were like, yeah, if I was starting something from scratch, I'd probably use this Redwood thing. And it's crazy to think years later their 1.0 just hit. But
yeah, I mean, that's what happens when you try and do everything. I say that with all, like, that is a very cool project. Like, we've been sharing the week with them, and they've been doing a great job of getting to V1, which we aren't even at yet. So more power to them. But yeah, it's like, Blitz kind of fell down that trap. Like, it's hard to do everything when the web is just such an open canvas. It's not like, you're building some sort of database or some sort of service that has a really limited set of, here's what it does and here's what it doesn't do.
Oh, Anthony from Redwood is actually here. So that's rad. Yeah, definitely need to get y'all on the show ASAP, man. Congrats on the launch. And I'm not trying to sound like I am hating at all. I am simply commenting on how crazy a lift it is to do everything from scratch like that, especially if you're not a big company like Google that can just hire a 100-person army to do it for you real fast. Like that is a boulder to push up a mountain.
I mean, they chose Prisma built in, which I feel like is just
interesting.
If anything shows they're on the right track on some of these choices, it's that.
That's really cool to hear. I know that like Blitz.js was one of the first I saw that chose Prisma built in, and I was really impressed with that decision. I definitely need to take another look at Redwood if something as much newer than it as Prisma is now part of like the default Redwood experience.
So Blitz is, I'm going to turn this in the most selfish way back to me, because Blitz is a really good example of where we saw like Blitz like is a huge, I think it's a good step forward if you're building something that they are good at, like on top of Next. It gives you all this really cool like universal app stuff around connecting your API calls, and what Redwood's doing now I think is a better probably even iteration on that. But because they chose Next.js as their foundation, like they did not own their full tech stack, and like they were opinionated but like not enough to survive. The context I say this in is I think they're shutting down Blitz or turning into something that's like just like essentially it's like long goodbye. It reminds me a lot of Deno, where Deno was at. Like TypeScript for Node has existed forever. There was this like TS Node package and it made Node do TypeScript. I'm like, okay, cool. But like they were opinionated enough in the right ways and they owned their full tech stack that like there's a reason you choose Deno over Node that's not just TypeScript for Node. So like as crazy as Astro's syntax can feel to someone coming from React, it is trying to be opinionated in the right ways where it matter, where it's like, this is a take on web development, and this is like a direction that web development should be going. And in all the ways it feels different are like intentional design choices that go beyond just like being unique or 1 or 2 features on top of React. It's a different way of thinking. And I feel like that's the way successful projects tackle these things. So where Blitz failed, Redwood could succeed because it's a lot more opinionated. But that's our take and why we kind of made the choices we did.
Makes a lot of sense. I will say on Brandon's behalf on Blitz.js, what I think happened there was they announced that the way Blitz was being built as this all-in-one thing was not going to be viable. I like to think for the same reasons I described with like SvelteKit and other tools, where owning everything like that is just an impossible feat. It's so much to own at once. And at the same time, he had just gotten into the same Y Combinator batch as me for this winter, and with flight control, which is a like CI and like a toolkit for deploying applications on your AWS. So it's like make your AWS feel like Vercel. And that's been where almost all of his focus was. So the announcement that I can't do this way, we should split things up, followed by joining Y Combinator and being fully focused on the company for the past 4-ish months, resulted in it feeling like Blitz announced a thing and then didn't like go very far, which has led to the feeling of maybe it's over. But it's absolutely not. They're splitting things up. There's a feature where it even uses TRPC within it to be the pipe between the front end and back end rather than providing that themselves. Okay. But they're trying to figure out
how do we misunderstood.
Yeah, how do we split Blitz.js into the like almost like a starter kit to do this way of development, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was like kind of trying to go the Vite route of like, if you want to build a meta framework, we're going to be like this kit of things you can connect to do it.
I think that's part of the mindset too. I can't say for sure how ironed down any of these things are yet. They're still early in proposals, and I know it's also just not where Brandon's focus has been. But I'm definitely excited for the future of what they do. That said, I have clearly not been paying anywhere near enough attention to Redwood, especially now that they're mentioning that TRPC works inside of it. Really need to hop in there.
Theo, I feel like just say TRPC support and you're like, all right, this is the new big thing.
The thing you could say instead, and you should have said it here, is I can call my database in my templates and have type safe responses.
I didn't know that was one step above TRPC for you.
For static, it is. Absolutely, it is. I don't want to have to install a whole framework just to call my backend close to where I want to render. If I'm making a static page and I can fetch from my database, I don't want to have to build a contract system. The thing I like about TRPC is it is the lightest possible contract system if TypeScript's on your backend and your front end. Yeah. But in this case, TypeScript's not on my front end. I don't have to care.
Yeah. It's like, I think that's where we're going to be the next couple of months is like, what is the right way to do these things? And like, can we be flexible while still being prescriptive in some ways? So like, if you wanted something that can make database calls on your client and you wanted TRPC to do it, should you still make TRPC calls on the server side? Or should you have like database calls happening directly in your front matter, which we love, but then having a different API contract for your front end? I don't know.
Interesting thought.
Like, it's the same thing as forms, right? Should you be posting to the page and only getting back an HTML response? The demo we showed in our Twitter like announcement of SSR, Ben did this like really awesome video. He's like wearing a spacesuit and walking through code. But the end of it, it was like, and by the way, I just built this entire e-commerce site inside of a no script tag. Like, you can do all of this. Now the question is like, is that the right way? And how do we talk to different audiences based on what they want?
Yeah, where do you post to is a harder question to answer than it sounds. And what do you respond to that post with is a whole different layer on top. Time for more hot takes?
Sure, yeah. I'm trying to think of this. I think one thing that I'll add on to this in terms of like where this could go, Nate on the team has been doing a ton, like for months now, has been like setting the seeds in place for like, what does like turbo links or like Hotwire, like what does if you really like the HTML part of the story, what does that look like? And combining that with partial hydration, this idea of every component living individually on the page. Can a form submission submit a form and like you're doing an HTML replacement of that form itself? So instead of thinking about like I posted to the page, you're thinking more I posted that component, I got back a response, and here's the new form, or here's the new buy button, or here's the new. It's kind of early days on that, so I don't really know how much to say about that. But the idea of being more like what Livewire is doing in Phoenix, I think it's called, or Hotwire, like this idea of
Livewire. I played with that a bunch when I was at Twitch. Actually, we were using that because when I started at Twitch, the small team I was on was not very fond of doing JavaScript when we didn't have to, and we used Ssr and Phoenix to run most of our video pipes for like the Bob Ross marathon and such.
Gotcha.
And Live View was a great way to. Phoenix Live View in particular was a great way to like show the status of a transcode on a server without having to render anything or write a component on the client. It almost felt like treating the browser like part of my like CI and like almost like my terminal. Like I could write out to it that way.
Yeah. If we ever do interactive components built with Astro, so not a framework, but like Astro itself, I bet that's the direction we go, where it's more of a live view just into a server code where you're getting updates. It would be our server components. It would be like streaming HTML that's still running on the server, but coming back and like updating that one island. That's not even close to coming in V1, but there's some really cool ideas there.
Interesting. Yeah, I have walked so far back and forth on the do I want something like live view, and I keep going back to I don't. I'm curious if this will go into the hot take I wanted to drop, which is if you could ever see yourself building the thing you're currently building, like as a web developer, as a mobile app, like if there could be value in this thing being a mobile application in the future, why the fuck are you using Remix and why the fuck are you using Astro? Like, those are not the right solutions there. If there's a world in which you have to return JSON because one of your clients needs it, that's when these tools stop making the most sense for the job.
Right. So thinking of like your API, I think I follow what you're saying, but like, why would I build my whole business as an Astro app if one of the clients talking to those API endpoints is going to be something that's not even web-based?
I think that something like Next.js or even a more traditional like full stack like GraphQL create React app solution makes more sense. And what you can get with something like Next.js with client-side caching and SSR is the ability to build a traditional, relatively static, fast-loading web application that I can now build a mobile app for and consume those same functions and calls there, if as long as I'm good about making them either like TRPC calls, an internal GraphQL endpoint, or even just like stubbing out like JSON like from endpoints there. If you use the encouraged patterns in something like Next.js, as long as you mentally turn off get server-side props because it's bad, you can have a really good time sharing those pieces across your mobile application, across your like native application, across other consumers of the endpoints as you need them. But there's, I think, a pretty strong line that I've now realized of, would there ever be another client for this? At that point, we might want to reconsider how we're doing it.
So I'll throw a hot take back at you to answer that. If you're at the point where you have more than one, and let's call them clients, like if you have more than one client, like the website being one client, right? But then you add a mobile app or, God, what else could be a desktop app? I guess those are kind of the two main ones. If you get to that stage where you have more than one consumer client of an API, that API should not live attached to the web code base. That should absolutely be moved out, because what you're going to fall into as a trap is the idea that these two are deployed together, and therefore I don't have to worry about backwards compatibility. Meanwhile, you have a whole app ecosystem that is like on older versions. They're being deployed separately. You can't think of your deployment at that point as one thing. Your API all of a sudden has to be thought of as a thing that is living separately from the web code base, because you have one client who at least is not tied to that.
Can't and
I think that's how I would describe that. What's that?
Can't and shouldn't are different things. There is definitely a world now where you can force clients to be as up-to-date as possible. I know like a good example of this would be Discord, where you cannot use Discord if you're not on the latest client version. It will just stop you and say, hey, we have to update. It won't even ask you. It just does it. And it's more and more applications that do that. In a world post-Expo, where your JavaScript layer, which is the thing that does the data fetching, is loaded from a server, you can block the application render on not being on the version. Like if I make a fetch request on the mobile application and it comes back with a header that's a more recent version than I have on my phone, then it could force the UI to refresh and pull the latest JavaScript. You can hard and like strictly enforce everything is synced. It's not the best thing to do. It's not super pleasant, but it is a pattern I see more and more moving towards. And you could totally build a mono repo such that you have a TRPC server, a Next.js app that deploys that TRPC server. It also consumes it for the application on the web, and a React native application that is also consuming TRPC the same way. And if the version ever breaks, you force the client to get the latest JavaScript.
So maybe I missed a subtlety of what you're saying. If I say that Astro API routes are one-to-one compatible and like equal feature set to Next.js API routes, does that change your hot take?
Not quite.
Because I think there is a messaging thing where we're like,
I can lint rule ban get server-side props. I can't lint rule ban calling 3 different like functions in the header at the top. And in Astro, the way I would get data from my database is I would call, like if I wanted to like get user data and load that on a page, the immediate way I do that with Astro SSR is at the top in like the or in the helmet, I would call
called the front matter component script.
Yeah, it always has new terms every time I talk about it. Markdown will always haunt me. The front matter section is I would the const user equals await prisma dot whatever. That's not an endpoint now. Well, it is, but it's an endpoint that serves HTML. If you disable the server functions in Next.js or lint rule ban them like I plan to and never use get server side props, you're now forced to write a backend function that can be treated as an API through something like TRPC. And now I can consume that as part of my SSR or as part of my client-side render or as part of another application's client render. But the direction our code base forces us in is defining things in a way that it's right now only being consumed by one client, but it totally is consumable by other clients as well. And that's the nature of what like the code base and the patterns we've enforced encourage. And it feels like the obvious solution with Astro isn't that, because it's not intuitive to import from an API route, or even worse, call it, lose the type safety signature, and pull that all through that way.
Yeah, I see what you like. Next.js encourages you to think in terms of an API that you're calling from your app, and we're very much encouraging like, no, call the database directly. Who cares?
Next doesn't even encourage it, but they allow me as the maintainer of the code base to discourage not doing that, which is nice enough. I think that what you have here is get server-side props, but you don't have to export it with a name. It just is the front matter. And get server-side props as a default is kind of scary to me.
Yeah, I'd say that our take then in that world, if posing that question to Astro, is that when you need that, you can refactor your code base easily enough to not basically have to worry about that problem. Basically, refactoring can solve that problem. But what you gain up until that point is the ease of just not thinking about it. So when it comes time to think in terms of APIs, you have the power and tools to build an API with Astro. But up to that point, make the database call. We don't care. When you need it, you'll get it.
Yeah. I think that that's actually very close to what Next's framing and model is around this too, where you have the ability to get this data right here and have it just be in the page in a script tag as soon as it loads. You have this JSON blob ready to go. I feel like it encourages bad behavior, and it's unclear for the average developer when they need to make that shift and when that pattern gets bad. And my concern would be, I, as a developer who is new to a bigger Astro code base, I see this TRPC thing that's used for most of the endpoints, but I see a few pages where we just call Prisma. How do I, as the new developer, know which I should do? And defining those those like rules and behaviors here is different enough that it's something I have to think about a lot more before I would adopt it at scale in one of our code bases.
Right. Yeah, we're taking the stance that like not thinking about it is good because you can move faster and then come back to it when you need to. But yeah, depending on how long you let that period go, if you're growing a team, 4 or 5, 10 developers, I wonder if there's a way you could just lint like no database calls. What's interesting for TRPC is you could have essentially your server side is actually the first client of TRCP.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever that app is becomes the second client. So I remember I said like, hey, you can put TRCP in Astro. And your response was, I'll just make the database calls directly. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could just lint for not doing that and you thinking of your server as
Prisma imports in routes. You can do that.
Literally, like get rid of Prisma anywhere. That would be a pretty easy lint rule. And therefore, the Astro SSR is both the API and then it's also its first client. That really wouldn't be a huge limitation other than now you have to think in that way. But you're saying that that's how you want to think. So great, you're paying the cost.
Yeah, I like that. It's not like, obviously a lot of this is just me mentally mapping the model of how things are working for me right now to this new thing that clearly wasn't built for me and seeing if I could force my weird patterns into it. But it passed the test. It seems like I can, and that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you love server rendering HTML, Astro has probably got something for you there. Yeah, I mean, again, like ping would probably be a really tough thing to build, but it would be possible.
Yeah, I love that. In particular, that you're not telling me to go rebuild my stuff that's working great as for applications in your weird new tech, but there are obviously things that this will work for. I know I'm excited to go hack together a quick view counter for my blog posts now on top of the new Astro SSR stuff and see what I can deploy that on. Might even do that for a stream in the next few weeks. It'd be really fun to test and take advantage of the infinite writes and pretty much infinite reads we get from something like Planet Scale, see how trivially we would be able to show a view count that dynamically updates when you refresh on our Astro blog.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Yeah, I'd love to see it. Love to. I can. If something breaks, let me know. I'll
Of
take a
course.
look.
I am curious, are there any like particularly awesome use cases you've seen or been thinking about for this tech? Something that in particular you didn't expect that has really floored you?
That's a good question. I'll shout out a couple of community members. There have been some really cool attempts at an image component. I think that's probably one of our most requested features. So our community's been working on that. Um, there's also a project called X Element, which has been going on for a while now, but it's the idea of what if Astro had a client component idea of like adding logic to the Astro template. Super interesting. I like have not ever considered that as a thing that we wanted, and now people are really loving it. So
Very
that's
interesting.
been an awesome project in the community to see. One sort of thing that's like deployment based would be Firebase has started using Astro for their blog, but talking to that team, starting to see this real use case for enterprises, which is this idea of if you're a big company and you want to support Next and SvelteKit and Nux, like your different front end teams might all want different tools for their job, and letting Astro be the one like DevOps piece, like one SSR engine for your team that loves Svelte, that loves React, that loves Vue. That's something I didn't even consider at all, but talking through like just what the Google needs are, like there's a really interesting story for enterprise there. Just like you talk about having lots of people, lots of developers, that's a way to reduce the cost of running every possible framework on the server, which is where the DevOps cost comes from.
I think that's again what I meant when I said the like competing with Vite thing, where Vite is
Yeah.
the way to build a Nuxt app, a Vue app, a Svelte app, a Solid app, and even a React app now if it's not Next.js. Astro could be the way to do that in the future. Like the
You're trying to get me to say we compete with Vite. We love
I know
Vite. They're powering us. We
you can
love
love things you
them.
compete with, and they can be part of your stack. There's a lot of like TypeScript competes with JavaScript, and it is JavaScript.
True, true. Um,
You're the
yeah, no,
TypeScript of Vite.
oh God. Um, yeah, maybe. I don't think that that's what they want. I really don't think that, but maybe. You never know.
Yeah, I saw Alex mention that or just back on the API abstraction thing, GraphQL is a really great example of how you can abstract an API in a way that can be consumed by many things. And if you have a relay compatible contract, that works. Yeah, there is a line that is, should I just be using GraphQL now? And I'm constantly trying to figure out where I put it. And it keeps moving further and further away from where it was a few years ago.
So here's the fun. You should tie this tangent directly into when you have the Redwood.js team on. Like this whole conversation about balancing ease of picking it up with like what's a best practice for a larger team. Redwood is taking the other side, the side that you're arguing for, which is they have built GraphQL in from day one. I would argue that GraphQL is overkill for a lot of sites,
yes,
but they're already thinking that way. So from day one, you get GraphQL. Is that worth it? That's the trade-off.
interesting. Yeah, I'm even more excited to chat with them now. Yeah, I'll be reaching out to them for sure. Going to open this up. I know that you have to run at around 5, so I'm going to open to chat once more for any questions. I have one more like fun, simple one. What was the biggest challenge you did not expect going into building SSR into Astro?
Oh God! So I should not take credit for this. Matthew has been working for like 3+ months on this. So that's Matthew Phillips, Matthew P on Twitter. Um, he's been doing all the heavy lifting here. I feel like we've been lucky that we did not build this for Node.js and are now having to retrofit it to EdgeWorkers, Lambda, like the trap that Next.js is in a bit now, trying to kind of work backwards. We've been able to start with that target. So it always compiles to one JS file. It can go on any Edge platform. That was a huge lift to get right, but one that's paid off dividends. Yeah, I'd say that's probably the biggest one. We're just in this kind of open, like it's all works now. Now what? What do we do with it? Is kind of like the big thing for us now. Like we're trying to just collect as much feedback, working with these hosting partners, but also working with users to just like learn from what they're building now that we've opened the floodgates.
Makes a ton of sense. I got one more question from chat quick. Any monetization ideas formalizing yet for Astro from Alex?
Oh God. So our big thing has been we don't want to do what Gatsby did, which all the love to the Gatsby team, but like I feel like they built Gatsby and then they're like, oh no, there's bugs with Gatsby. Let's like build a hosting company to solve the performance problems and like let that monetization drive affect the platform they were trying to build. Like right when they probably needed to invest in the framework most, they started to like get distracted. again, all the love to that project, but they've clearly had their challenges. I think the way that we're trying to structure all of this, like the only incentive we're ever going to put for the company is that like how can we support a platform that is Astro? So if you think of like one of the things we launched today was themes, integrations, like how can we kind of sit below what you're building, not in a way that's a hosting company at all, but just like supporting a healthy ecosystem. I'd say that's where we're more curious. And I don't know what that's going to look like, to be honest. We're trying not to let it distract us too much, but I would look out for more things around themes and integrations and like plugging things into Astro. Everything in this e-commerce world is looking at like WordPress as the big kind of monster Goliath to tackle, and like their ecosystem is just one you can't beat. So I'd say that's more our inspiration than like if Remix is looking at hosting, if Gatsby is looking at hosting. Netlify is one of our biggest sponsors. We love them. Like we don't want to get in the same way we don't want to compete with React. Like we don't want to compete with hosts like Vercel and Netlify either.
So what I'm hearing is $10 a month mobile app for building websites.
I think more
image compression as a service.
Oh God, no. I think basically that like if we can help build a ecosystem where people are able to build things and get charged for their work and like making open source on top of Astro sustainable, I'd say that's something I'm much more interested in. Like there's definitely a niche of things that are open source, and there's a niche of things that are like I'm investing a bit more of my time and want to get paid for it. I want to build an integration or a theme where I can make money off my work, and trying to explore that in a way that is true to open source without being like completely bankrupt morally capitalism, I think is where I want us to fit. And then we can just sit on making the biggest ecosystem, and if the ecosystem gets bigger, we win. That's where I want to see this go.
What if it's morally aligned but technically bankrupt, like iframing Astro apps in for images?
Would say that again.
Iframe images as a service.
Oh God, I hope not. I think what I mean by all this is like all these cool things, whether it's iframed images or like even something that was image compression. Could we build that in a way where we're not the ones actually implementing it? It's a service that exists that anyone can choose to connect to or not. That's where I'm more curious to see us explore.
Very exciting stuff. It's definitely different when we look at the space and see a whole bunch of companies trying to figure out how they can take a little bit of AWS's money. I feel like that's where everyone's at. It's like, how can we get you to spend a little more on your servers and have a little bit of that go to us, rather than how can we make the space better and possibly make a cut of that improvement?
Yeah. I mean, you've just, I think, outlined the conspiracy theory of the decade, which is the move of work to the server means more money in AWS's pocket. Mm-hmm. This whole game is being orchestrated by Amazon. I think that's what you've uncovered here.
So what you're saying is the real enemies are Create React App versus AWS, and the reason Facebook continues investing into React is their real competition against Amazon?
Create React App is the only hero we have left.
Yeah. The only reason React exists is to keep Facebook server costs down.
If anyone from the React team is listening, like, please do some ESM, anything. React 18, still CommonJS. Why? Please, no more.
I do not have any horses in the ESM CommonJS race at the moment because I have one dependency that's CommonJS. All of my dependencies are CommonJS, so I don't think about it too much yet. But
it's not a race. They're the only ones still doing this. It's because it's Facebook. They have a huge tool chain built around CommonJS. They don't need it. But like, please, as someone who's built a tool like Vite and now is building on top of Vite, it hurts me. It hurts me so much.
Yeah. We'll just move to Preact and not talk about it anymore.
Or Solid.
Solid is very much growing as an option. It is surprisingly copy-pastable for me, which was the reason I liked Preact, where I could copy-paste some code into a Preact app and mostly it will work. Can roughly do the same with at least like the easy, annoying parts of the code, like all of the JSX copy-pasting is really nice.
Yeah, totally.
Not getting any more questions, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you for the nearly 2 hours of time hanging out with us live. This has been an awesome show. I'm super excited to get this up on YouTube later as well as a VOD. Thank you again so much for stopping by and taking the time, man.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Any last words to anyone who might be in the audience before we shut this down?
I already gave my React plea. That's my new. That's the hill I'm going to die on.
Make sure the React team knows that we need some ESM as soon as possible. Thank you again.
And to anyone watching, please check out Astro. The SSR stuff's really cool. I feel like there's a ton more code examples to check out on our site. Our Discord, astro.build/chat. That's where we do a lot of our hanging out. So please join us there.
Yeah, the Discord is awesome. It's actually been one I go and hang out in just to see how like the community features work. 'Cause I haven't seen too many others using it, but they have like weekly presentations and shit in there. It's so cool. So definitely check out in there as well. I saw that on the Twitch stream we shared Fred's socials. I will copy paste those for YouTube really quick so you guys can have them there as well before we shut down. There is that, and make sure you check out Astro as well at astro.built. There it is. Thank you.